Should misogyny be a crime? Police chiefs say that violence against women and girls is at an epidemic level and has become a national emergency. An official report found that more than 1 million violent crimes against women and children were recorded in the last 12 months leading up to March 2023. That's the equivalent to almost 3,000 crimes every day in England and Wales alone. What's particularly shocking is the average age of a suspect accused of sexually abusing girls is 15, while the average age of their victim is just 13. Now, the police say that the levels are so high that they can't tackle this alone, and they are asking for more support from people like tech firms to curb misogynistic influencers like Andrew Tate, who appeal to young men. So, what can be done about this? Would making misogyny a crime tackle the issue, Nicola?
Making it a specific crime, unfortunately, I don't think would tackle the issue. Our criminal system, justice system, is at breaking point anyway. There are people waiting for rape cases to go through the courts that take sometimes, up to 7 years. Making this a specific crime wouldn't necessarily change anything. I think what we need to do is have a look at the wider culture of misogyny. At the moment, unfortunately, misogyny or misogynistic crimes are not classed as hate crimes, unlike crimes that might be homophobic, transphobic or racially aggravated. They could be classed as hate crimes. There was a report done into whether or not misogyny should be classed as a hate crime a few years ago now, and the Law Commission came back and said that actually if we were to take crimes against women as hate crimes, it might make things even more complicated, clog up the criminal justice system and actually create this two-tiered system by which an assault on a woman you might have to prove to a much higher standard, which is what hate crime law is supposed to do, to a much higher standard that something not only was a crime, not only that somebody committed a crime, but they were fueled by a hatred of women. And that might mean that we might even get fewer convictions as a result.
So no to making misogyny a crime in its own. What do we do then?
That is the evergreen question, isn't it? I think that having discussions about, the stats you were just reading out then, this isn't just about misogyny. It's specifically misogyny by and towards teenagers. You're citing Andrew Tate there. I think it's often we do focus and hone in on Andrew Tate, the individual, but also we need to be looking at tech companies, social media companies, whose algorithms are pushing out these kind of influencers who are so derogatory towards women, who celebrate violence against women and celebrate sexual violence as well, and speaking about women as if they're objects. I think that social media companies have to do an awful lot more. In the same way that hopefully you wouldn't let a man like that come on your programme, social media companies shouldn't be pushing the algorithms of the content of men who say those things.
What do you think, Geoff? Is it making misogyny a crime in and of itself? So tackling the really lower levels of misogyny, we're talking about wolf whistling, catcalling, that sort of thing, making that a crime? Or do we have to tackle the social media companies to stop influencers like Andrew?
I sort of agree with Nicola. I don't think it does really help because, one, it's a higher burden of proof. How do you actually prove it? What if you get otherwise valid cases thrown out because you couldn't literally prove that particular aspect of that threshold? And I don't think that the kind of psychopaths that do stuff like this, and I'm talking in particular about actual violence and sexual violence, is I don't think realistically they would stop and think, this would be a misogynistic crime. They're doing psychopathic things. I don't think that would play into their thought process. So changing the law, the only purpose of changing the law would be to reduce the number of offences. So just on a basic level, I don't think introducing misogyny would work.
But would it create a signal to society that these things that we've accepted, the catcalling, etc., are unacceptable, they are not appropriate, and they must be stamped out?
It would have symbolic value. It would absolutely have symbolic value, but if it results in certain court cases being unprovable because they couldn't prove that particular component. And it's also interesting that you say about catcalling and harassment. When we say violence here, we are including everything from murder, violence, sexual assault, and we've also got stalking and harassment. And I suppose another question that occurs to me is whether having so many of them in the same category also muddies the waters somewhat, because I would imagine, I mean, if you look at these numbers are so depressing. They've gone up exponentially, undeniably.
37% in the last 4 years.
I mean, it's a huge, and I do wonder if, when you look at particularly the stalking and the harassment element of it, that the increasing ease with which people can be found online has sadly dovetailed with that. So I wonder if putting them in together also slightly obscures the different nature of some of what's going on.
It's all the same mindset, though, isn't it? And I speak as somebody who has been the victim of, I'd say, misogynistic, fueled stalking and harassment. The guy who stalked and harassed me sent me violent sexual images and very much targeted me because I was a women's rights campaigner. And that kind of behaviour, that along with somebody who is a rapist, I would argue that all rapes against women are misogynistic because of the nature of the act that has been done against a woman. It stems from that same thought process that I believe is that women are inferior. Women are subhuman.
A hatred towards
women.
Also, just you're calling them psychopathic, and we do hear all the time that it is just a small number of men. Actually, 1 in 20 adults, 2.3 million people in England and Wales, are perpetrators of such violent crime every year, or at least this year. This says every year. 2.3 million people, when we think we only have 100,000 places in jails in England and Wales, the two don't really add up. I mean, so no wonder the police are saying that they can't tackle this alone.
Well, the average age that you said as well, that was particularly alarming. I've got to say, and this might sound quite old-fashioned, I do think, you know, once as a child, a boy encounters somebody like Andrew Tate, that will always rub up against the moral code that he was instilled with as a child. And it sounds really simple and old-fashioned, but parenting, I mean, like very early on, I remember my mum in particular, but also my dad talking to me about respect for women, about conduct, about things that might be seen as, you know, old-fashioned these days, but how you acknowledge that there's a difference in strength and physical presence, and how you accommodate that and make people feel comfortable. The fact that the average age is 15, so what that means is there's a hell of a lot of boys that are also younger than that as well. That's particularly alarming. So by all means, of course, we should focus on the toxic influences at one end, but how boys interpret what they're being told then, a lot of that will come down to what their moral framework is by that time.
Yeah.
Which at 15, you would hope that it would still be their parents predominantly. Maybe I'm very naive on that. Neil from London, what do you think? How do we tackle this level of misogyny in society?
Well, clearly we need to address all of the awful examples that you gave there. But I think from a legal perspective, you have to take it back to the fundamentals in that misandry should be illegal if misogyny is going to be illegal. I mean, you can't really have it one way without the other. There's got to be equivalence and equal law for all, surely. So, if
misandry causes an awful lot less deaths than misogyny, Neil.
Quite possibly, but nonetheless, there is a room for violence in there. So, are we to say women would never, for instance, radical feminists would never say misandristic comments to a guy? Would they never do that? I think they would. So it should be.
I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that it's probably not as prevalent, Neil, as misogyny. It's very easy to undermine a problem like misogyny by bringing up, well, what about misandry? I don't want to do that in this debate, because the predominant problem, as the police chiefs have said, is misogyny. We have an epidemic level of violence against women and girls. How do we solve that problem, Neil?
Absolutely. Well, at the opening, I did put that position forward about those misogynistic examples you gave were terrible.
It's very interesting, though, Neil, that you would bring that up at the top of your explanation of your feelings and kind of push it to one side and then focus on, but what about men angle? Actually, if this was to be brought into law, it wouldn't just be specifically misogyny, it would be sex as a protected characteristic, which means that men and women would both be covered. But I just think it is interesting that you sort of seem to have pushed to one side the actual crux of the story that we're talking about here in favour of saying, what about men?
No, I'm fully on board with the horrors of misogyny that you were saying there. I was just saying misandry does exist.
Yeah.
From a legal framework, I understand that. That's my point.
Okay. We're all in agreement, Neil. How do we solve the problem of violence against women and girls?
I think violence against everybody is bad, I suppose, but I think it's going to be an uphill struggle. I mean, there's always going to... it's going to be difficult. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I think if you track the rise in numbers, I mean, you can almost look at. I would imagine that you can index at least part of it to the rise in smartphones. So as you say rightly, it's a spectrum of behaviour that might start with stalking and harassment, and can always lead to more things. I mean, just like so much else. I mean, we can say social media, but that's such a broad idea these days. And just simply cameras, phones, pictures, being able to take videos of things, being able to track where people are, Google Street View. There's a whole framework of technology now that means it's much harder to not be found. And when it comes to things like stalking and harassment, being found is the problem.
Yeah.
Yes, so stalking becomes very hard when it comes to social media, but the levels of charges and prosecutions against individuals that perpetrate these sorts of crimes are woefully low, despite the amount of CCTV, despite the amount of evidence that there seems to be around. So how do we sort this out?
I mean, we also saw recently in the King's speech that spiking was not made a specific offence.
No.
I mean, which was quite incredible. I don't understand why. First, it's one of those things that I imagine a lot of the viewers will say, well, it's not already. No. And then there was an opportunity to bring in legislation early for a Labour government that have made an absolute priority about women's security. Maybe they'll do it later in the Parliament, but it feels imperative now.
Well, we'll see what they do with that, but that is part of this issue as well. Lynn from Norfolk, what's your view when it comes to crimes against women and girls? How do we solve this, national emergency, as the police say?
Well, I think we've got to go top to bottom and root it out wherever. I think the police is a good starting point. I know my local council in Norwich actively promotes that kind of attitude. You are not allowed to complain about male staff if they say something that is offensive to you, misogynistic.
Well, I don't have a right of reply from them, so we're edging on.
No. I can understand that, but trust me,
I'd rather stay away from this. But what you're saying is there's institutional sexism inbuilt in certain police forces across the country. Is your belief?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Definitely.
I don't think many people would probably disagree with that, including the police chief, who say that there is an absolute problem that they want to root out.
Yeah, there have been multiple reports that have found that to be the case in many different police forces across the country. But I think right now is a really particularly scary time for women because we're staring down the barrel of the US election as well, where I know the democratic choice has changed over the past couple of days. But if we're looking at Donald Trump, a man who was found legally liable for sexual assault. Now, when he gets called a criminal, he gets called all sorts of things under the sun. People so rarely mention the fact that he has bragged about grabbing women in the crotch. He has been found, as I said, in a civil trial, legally liable for sexual assault. And this is the man who is going to be potentially ruling the free world and having a lot of influence online as well.
I mean, that is a worry, is a return to very culturally old-fashioned views about women and their place in the world. And, we need to talk more about the fact that we just had an election where there were certain constituencies, where there were groups of people who supported certain causes that didn't seem to think that female MPs had a right to talk and followed them around, harassed them, made them feel intimidated. So we've got some fairly Stone Age attitudes resurfacing, and we need to be brave in talking about where that's coming from and what we can do about it. Yeah,
but what's interesting is we're talking about very specific examples that have been in the press. With these sorts of numbers, 2.3 million people, I'm going to say men, out there perpetrating these sorts of crimes. Yeah. That's epidemic across the nation. There's no wonder that there's a sort of sexist attitude in the police. It would appear that there's a sexist attitude in a lot of institutions across the country with those sorts of stats. But thank you for your call, Lynn. Sarah from Liverpool, what's your view when it comes to tackling this issue? If we made misogyny a crime, do you think that would help? Would it send out a clear signal?
The trouble is, we've made everything else a crime. You can't be... No one can come out with anti-disablist stuff or anything, or ethnic or anything else. The problem is, it's still there, and it is woefully policed. If someone makes a complaint, gets nowhere. Where's the proof? That's what you get.
I see what you're saying, but we still know that it's wrong to be racist. We know that it's wrong to discriminate against disabilities because it's enshrined in law. We know that these things are wrong. Now, sex, you can't discriminate against someone because they're a woman. That is already enshrined in law. But what we're talking about here with misogyny is to say anything that shows a hatred or contempt towards women, including catcalling, including sexually approaching women that are that's unwanted or unwarranted, all of these things that we might think are just day-to-day experiences of women, we now say this is illegal, it's wrong, and we will not accept it in society.
We can do that, but you can bet your boots it would just get ignored. The only way we're going to get through this is if we deal with it literally from the get-go. Education.
Okay.
Rule 1, do not let, the likes of the Andrew Tate and the rest of this incel misogynistic culture that's sprung up over the last 10, 15 years has got to be knocked on the head. And there has to be a strong counter voice to that from both men and women. Both sexes have got to come together on this because I remember reading a few years ago about a similar problem in Australia where various sports stars thought they had the right to rape women in rugby league. And it was quite a simple thing. They said, right, lads, when you've had a few drinks, walk out to the bar and the club, will you? Because let's get one thing straight. Rape is wrong. You do that, you're out the club and you are in the nick. And you've just got to be blunt.
Well, I'm glad that worked, but I would
counter argument to these kids, for these kids. We've got young, impressionable young men who need a counter voice to all of this hatred that they're hearing, and also some more mature men. Not talking about Donald Trump; he's a lost cause, and his ilk. But the rest of them, you've got to try and say, look, this is wrong. Would you like to be treated like this, like a piece of meat? And believe you and me, I've seen some women do that on a night out. Believe you and me.
Well, you're from Liverpool. I'm sure it's very similar to Glasgow. Sarah, thank you very much for your call. Interesting. Some people think we need to start at the top with Trump and institutions. Other people think we need to start with the ground up, similar to you, with parenting, education in schools, and maybe a louder counter voice. Pamela from County Durham, what's your view on this? Should misogyny be made a crime?
Yes, it should. I feel it should be made a crime because every day or every week or whatever, people are hearing stories about misogyny and men hating women and stuff, and it's just, it basically is crime against women. And I don't care what people say about other people, but yes, it should be stamped out and it should be made to go through the courts, men who are guilty of it, and
do you think,
they should be put in prison.
Well, but I've just went through 2.3 million people perpetrated these sorts of crimes a year. We only have 100,000 places in prison, so there's absolutely no way that all of these individuals, in fact, a fraction of them will see the inside of a cell. That is just an unfortunate
more prisons, you know?
Yeah. We would have to have quite a few. I think this is probably a societal issue we're going to have to deal with in a different way. And the police themselves have said that they simply can't do this on their own. So we're going to, as a society, have to find some other route. Pamela, thank you very much for your call. Thanks for all your calls on this.